welcome to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With you today, as always, is the host and the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, Irina Zuckerman. And today's guest is Joseph Humire, who is the executive director for the Center for Secure Free Society, which specializes in Latin American issues. Today's topic mainly focuses on Iran's defense relations with Venezuela in particular, as well as its proxies and their presence in Latin America, and the challenges it presents for the Monroe Doctrine, an early U.S. foreign policy issue, one of its early original positions that essentially considers the Latin American countries, continues all of the hemisphere as part and parcel of U.S. Defense and security priorities, and guards against invasion or entry by foreign forces from the outside Iran, and its proxies being some of them. With that, I'm turning to Joseph, who will tell us a little bit about himself, his background, and the work of his center before we turn to the main topic of the discussion today.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Irina, for the invitation. It's great to be here on your show. And background on myself. So I've been doing work in the think tank world for about a decade now, maybe a little bit more. Prior to that, I was in the military. I was in the Marine Corps. I was deployed to the Middle East, specifically to Iraq. I was also deployed to Africa. And I did an exercise in Latin America, a multinational training exercise. So I got to see a little bit of that South-South network, but from a military perspective. And then when I went into the think tank world, I really started to delve more into the threat networks that were moving from the Middle East through Africa into Latin America, but from an academic perspective. And so the Center for Secure Free Society, we're a national security think tank based in Washington, D.C., and we began about 10 years ago. And one of the core issues, one of the main issues that we've decided to address is that of Iran's presence and growing influence in Latin America. When we began looking at this a decade ago, I thought maybe this is something we're going to focus on for the next year, 2 years, and then we'll transition and move on to some other issues. And we certainly are touching other issues, but it's been sort of like that onion where you just unravel a layer and then you get another layer and then another layer, and you realize how complex the problem set really is and how long it's been going on. I mean, literally since the dawn of the Iranian Revolution, 1979, they made a decision to go to Latin America pretty much on day one, and they've been there, so 40 years in the making. And so I think at this point, their presence is pretty entrenched in the region. So we've been one of the few think tanks in Washington that's really dedicated a lot of time and resources to looking at that issue, analyzing it, and speaking about it with policymakers.
That's quite amazing, especially since the mainstream media and the traditional foreign policy elites, as they like to consider themselves, tend to kind of utilize the issues related to Latin America in their discourse. One of the exceptions has been, of course, some basic scholarship, related to Hezbollah's presence in Latin America, but that's also been largely tangential to the general topic. And I'm sure that you must have met some level of resistance of even trying to introduce this angle to the general discussion. You actually just mentioned before we started talking that you helped produce a documentary with CNN showcasing Hezbollah, how Venezuela has given Hezbollah, provided Hezbollah with passports that have been used in various operations.
Yeah, when I began looking at this, let's say circa 2009, 2008, it really was in kind of that fringe category in foreign policy. Like even the Iran experts in Washington, which there's a lot of Iran experts in the Beltway, They might have heard something. They obviously knew about the Ami attack in the 90s in Argentina. They might have heard a little bit about Chavez and Ahmadinejad, but they thought it was a very peripheral thing for Iran. Maybe like an ambition, something Iran would like to do, but that maybe necessarily can't do, and something very exotic. They didn't think it was core to Iran's foreign policy. It obviously is not core to their ambitions in the Middle East, and it was treated kind of as such. The Latin Americanists, the folks that focus on Latin America, they were just completely blind to it. They thought that that was coming from the crazy corner, that this is just more conspiracy talk or alarmist and people that want to essentially drive a narrative that doesn't exist. And so that was around for a good chunk. Now, I began looking at this as an investigator, as a researcher, so I didn't necessarily publish a lot of what I was talking about. I've actually spent about 2, maybe 3 years researching the issue, traveling to Latin America, several of the countries, traveling to the Middle East, some countries there, and connecting the dots, but without publishing anything. I was giving briefings both to the Defense Department, also to folks in Congress. And around, I think in 2011, a series of congressional hearings started to take place on Capitol Hill, because there was essentially a policy discussion between legislators, the U.S. congressmen, and the State Department at the time. They had a difference of opinion on this issue. Policymakers, congressmen were thinking that there was something to look at when it comes to Iran and Latin America. And this really kind of blew open when there was a case in Washington, D.C., a judicial case that got exposed to the public, and it just drew a lot of questions. That was the case of when there was a supposed assassination plot by the Quds Force to kill the Saudi ambassador as he dined in a restaurant in Washington, D.C., in a restaurant called Cafe Milano. When the Department of Justice put out that press release with the indictment and an individual they actually arrested and later convicted for being involved in this plot, people started to really ask themselves, what is this all about? Because apparently the connection that the Quds Force was trying to make would have passed through in a Mexican drug cartel. So they would have hired a direct Mexican drug cartel to carry out an assassination of a Saudi ambassador in a Washington, D.C. restaurant, and literally blowing up the restaurant, which would have probably killed who knows how many civilians and others. So that kind of woke up Capitol Hill on this issue. That was back in 2011. A lot of questions came out, a lot of hearings. And so I was briefing, but not necessarily publicly during that period. But what I realized, and I really realized this with a lot of the work we did with the Defense Department back then, was I realized that this problem wasn't really at the operational level. Even back then, there were folks in the Defense Department, folks in the U.S. government that were looking at this. They were looking at this from multiple angles, from money laundering angles, sanctions evasion, proliferation of threat networks. They were looking at it from multiple angles, and each one was studying this from different perspectives. But there was a gap between what was being done at the operational level and what policymakers understood at the political level. So when I understood that, I understood that it doesn't make sense to just be talking about this with defense officials and military leaders. I need to be talking about this publicly, and that prompted me to publish a book in 2014 called Iran Strategic Penetration in Latin America, and also to publish a policy report in 2014, which that goes to that issue that you're talking about. The first policy report that we ever published at SFS, and the first policy report I ever published at SFS, was about this immigration security scheme between Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and Hezbollah. So we actually were the first think tank to publish this a scheme where the Venezuelan government was providing government identification documents to suspected members of Hezbollah, obviously the Iranian proxy group in Lebanon. And in that, we were able to first document it, and we were also able to consult with many law enforcement officials, both here in the U.S., but most importantly in Canada, who had already been seeing this and had specific data and information that they were putting it in a reserved form at the time, but then eventually it became part of the public discussion. So that prompted the CNN piece, because a couple years later, and this was actually CNN en Español, the Spanish-speaking branch of CNN, they became interested in this. They met with me and they discussed the potential to do a documentary to start looking into this, an investigation, and it lasted a while. They have a very rigorous investigative team, and then it went from being a documentary that was going to be published in Spanish in CNN Español to then becoming the first joint investigation between CNN Español, the Spanish branch, and CNN Domestic, the United States branch. So they did a joint investigation, and then they eventually aired it in February 2017. The documentary is called Passports in the Shadows. And one of the keys to making that documentary work was they found a protagonist. And the protagonist is an individual named Misael Lopez Soto. And he was a Venezuelan legal attaché at the Venezuelan embassy in Iraq. So he was a first-hand witness. He was an eyewitness to what we had discussed years earlier, but he obviously had more information and he had first-hand knowledge about how this scheme was actually being carried out. And he provided that at least partially in the CNN documentary. So that helped give it credibility. That process that I just described, it took this issue of Iran and Hezbollah in Latin America out of the crazy corner in Washington, D.C., and into serious conversations among government officials, among policymakers, and with other countries as well. And since then, we've been continuing to work on it ever since.
It's interesting because I tend to be one of those people personally who tends to be in those crazy corners before they become a big thing. So back when I was still in law school, and that was before 2011, I graduated in 2009, we had presentations about these early security investigations into Hezbollah presence in Latin America. At that point, there were only, sub-chapters in books, but it already generated enough evidence to show that there was much more to the story. It just wasn't being explored. I'm glad to see that that interest has become more mainstream. Nevertheless, there's still a great deal of reluctance to take any serious action beyond policy discussions. For instance, there's been a great deal of attention to the Iranian ships tracking back and forth between Venezuela, the oil, gold, and weapons exchanges, and so forth, and even discussions about the potential for more dangerous chemicals being transported, but not really any serious effort to kind of reveal the full pattern of what happens to those ships, or for that matter, there hasn't been any great deal of interest in the Africa angle and how some of the ships go from Venezuela to Africa and vice versa. I'm wondering if that's an issue that you think is paying attention to.
No, absolutely. And I think that you're right. I think now that Iran's presence is very visible in Venezuela specifically, then policymakers and I think just the international community has, maybe they are not putting all the attention that I think they should be putting on this, but they're paying more attention to it. And they're trying to ask questions and they're wondering why, how, for what, the kind of big questions that kind of try to make you understand what's really behind these fuel and food transfers that are happening from Iran to Venezuela. So let me start by saying that I think it's important to note that, and I think most folks that study Iran know this pretty well, that Iran's history of using commercial activity as a dual use activity is very well documented. Iran tends to use commerce as a pretext or as a cover for other nefarious activities. It could be illicit activities, but it could also be military activities, which mostly are sanctioned by the international community and definitely by the United States. And so what I think whenever you see Iranian commercial activity in places that it doesn't make a lot of sense, such as the Iranian gasoline transfers to Venezuela, you have to ask, is that just gasoline or is there a different purpose for that? I'm going to give a precedent that I think is worth mentioning in a second. But with that, I think it's also important to note that the Maduro regime, the other side, the recipient of this gasoline, has the same modus operandi. They also use commercial transfers as a dual use activity or as a cover for other more nefarious things. So you really have these two regimes in different parts of the world, the Iranian regime in the Middle East and the Maduro regime in Venezuela and Latin America, that really have the same model for how they export how they govern and how they export their revolutions through their respective regions. So the know-how, I think, that between the two of them is very strong. Now, the precedent that I wanted to mention, I'm going to go back a little bit in history just for this, is the Ami attack, right? I think that's the number one thing that most people, when they hear about Iran, Latin America, they may, oh, I do remember that terrorist bombing in Argentina, which was a tremendous bombing, and it happened twice, actually three times. There was the 92 bombing on the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina, that killed 25 people and injured hundreds more. Then there was the July 1994 bombing of the Amia Culture Center, the Jewish Culture Center in Buenos Aires as well, killing 85 people. But then people forget the day after the Amia attack in Argentina, there was the takedown of the Alas Chiricanas flight in Panama that also killed a couple dozen people that took that flight. All of those attacks have been attributed to Hezbollah, and the two attacks in Argentina attributed to Iran. And so one of the things that I learned by investigating that incident was the way that Iran created the terror finance mechanisms to be able to carry out those three attacks one after the other. And one of the main ways that they carried out that terror finance, how they were able to move the money, was by using their commercial connections in Argentina. Back in that day, in the 1980s, the only commercial relationship that Iran had with Argentina was in the beef trade. Argentina was one of the largest exporters of beef in the world. Probably everyone remembers the Argentine steak. It's very famous. And so Iran was lucky to be privileged to have a preferential trade relationship with Argentina, to the point that by 1987, I believe it's about 70% of the domestic consumption of beef in Iran came from Argentina. So they were getting very quality beef. But instead of enjoying that commercial relationship, trade relationship, as most more democratic countries would do, they exploited that relationship instead. And what they did is they used the beef trade as a cover to be able to insert spies, front companies, and other operatives to carry out that terrorist attack in 92 and 94. How did they do it? Well, because Iran is an Islamic republic, any import of beef has to pass through halal. They have to have a halal certification. So they introduced halal certification companies in Argentina to a country that did not know anything about the Islamic guidance or processes of beef exports. So if Iran was to send, let's say, 5 or 10 commercial attaches to their embassy in Buenos Aires to manage two beef companies, it would look a little suspicious. Their foreign ministry might draw a red flag. But if you send 10 to 12 or 20 cultural attaches, and you say they're not there just for the commercial aspect, they're there because of the religious cultural aspect, Argentina said, sure, we're not going to get in the way. We're not going to fight you on that. We don't understand that process, but sure, that's your religion, that's your faith. Go ahead. What turns out is that the Iranian embassy, prior to the bombings, increased in personnel, mostly among cultural attaches. And those cultural attaches were doing, obviously, intelligence work and financial logistical work to carry out in preparation for the terrorist attacks in 92 and 94. And so that kind of just gives you a precedent for how Iran uses trade, how Iran uses commerce. And now it's that times 100, because they're not just sending beef or importing beef from Argentina. Now they're sending massive shipments of gasoline. They opened up a supermarket in Venezuela called Megasis. They have all kinds of different agreements with the Maduro regime in Venezuela and with other countries in the region. So I just wanted to make that as a point so people to understand that it's not just about commerce. They obviously use that as a mechanism for something else.
So interestingly, Iran, which has actually the Islamic Republic rose on the back of leftists in Iran, who eventually were subsumed by the Islamic Revolution, as it so happens. And it's now once again cooperating with socialist regimes and governments in Latin America, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Argentina, where the same clique is back in power. And we are seeing potentially we've seen some operations in Colombia with FARC previously, but now there is another leftist candidate leading in the polls, and Chile has recently welcomed a leftist government, not to mention Bolivia. That's also been another source of this activity. Brazil has been less radical politically, but also open to working with Iran in the past. So Iran has quite a broad nexus of potential activity throughout, and even Mexico has provided opportunities through cartels, and this current government is also fairly leftist and also fairly aligned with those cartels. How, you know, looking at the pattern from 1 2 3 countries now seeming expanding scope of Iran's activity in Latin America, that pattern is in itself quite disturbing. And yet there seems to be no lessons learned either by the voters and populations in those countries, the regimes that are looking for anyway to cooperate with them, or for the United States, which has not been paying much attention to trying to disrupt these relationships. Can you comment on why that's been kind of overlooked? The fact that Iran is not just sticking to Venezuela and Cuba, but is actually expanding its operations throughout the entire continent.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. So I recently published an article for a military magazine that's published by U.S. Southern Command. That's the combatant command of the military that works and monitors Latin America. And they have a military magazine that they publish twice a year called Dialogo. So I published an article in the latest edition, the first edition of 2022, called Iran's Pattern of Penetration. So that's a term that I've used. I used it first in the book, and I've used it in reports and testimonies since then, because I think after 40 years of Iran's activity in Latin America, there's enough empirical evidence to see a trend, to see a pattern, to see a modus operandi for how Iran operates in the region. Obviously requires some study, but nonetheless, if you do the work, you can start to see these trends. And so what that pattern of penetration is elaborated is I've called it like multiple steps. So Iran, and I'm going to describe it very basically. It's described in more detail in the article, but essentially Iran begins this from the religious and cultural level. They use that as an entry point into Latin America. Small Shia Islamic populations that may not be very big, but they could be very relevant for Iran getting into a specific country. They also work with Hezbollah to embed into, or infiltrate even, embed into the Lebanese and Syrian and Arab populations in Latin America, which those are much bigger, obviously, than the Islamic populations, and bigger than, obviously, than the Iranian populations in Latin America. Some of those numbers can range in the millions in the case of countries like Brazil, which has a very big Lebanese population in its country. But they use that informal presence by creating Islamic cultural centers, by financing mosques, by creating charities, associations, and a bunch of non-governmental organizations that allow them to have presence. They also allow them to study and learn about the country. But once they do that for long enough, and some of that stuff takes a little time, it could take a decade or more, but once they do it for long enough, and as I mentioned, they've been there 40 years now, they then switch to a more formal presence. They begin to find ways that their embassies can have more political contacts, more economic leverage, more connection to the business and the political elites of a country. And then they expand that once they're able to get their diplomats and their embassy personnel better well connected with some level of essentially some level of political cover. And so this kind of pattern, it describes how Iran went from having only 6 embassies at the beginning of the 21st century to now, and really by 2009, having 11 embassies in Latin America, and potentially it could have a few more if it continues to do this work. And what the point of this pattern of penetration that they describe in the article, the question that you naturally would ask is, well, where is this going? Like, what is the end state? What is the end game? Well, it's just like it is everywhere else in the world, and I'd say even in the Middle East. What's the end state in Syria or the end state in Iraq? They use the informal, the cultural, the diplomatic, the economic, eventually to just get military presence. They eventually establish a military beachhead, just like as they've done in Syria, as they're done in Yemen, as they've done in Iraq, as they've done in Lebanon, a little less so because they have Hezbollah, but nonetheless, that's still essentially an Iranian presence because of their nature of that relationship with Hezbollah. So that's the same modus operandi comes to Latin America. They build proxy groups, but eventually they want to build the conditions inside the countries so that they can bring their military to the Western Hemisphere, to Latin America. And so eventually it's getting there. I think the only countries that I've seen it evolve to the point where they have military presence at some level of consistency is Venezuela and Bolivia. Venezuela and Bolivia have evolved throughout that entire pattern. And I actually argue that even though I think most people are looking at Venezuela because of obvious reasons, the tankers and just the visible nature of the relationship between Maduro and Iran, but I actually argue that Bolivia has probably been more successful for Iran because when Iran started its activity in Bolivia in the mid 2000s, they had zero presence. They did not have an embassy. There's not a sizable Arab population. There's pretty much no Iranian. I don't know about much of an Iranian population, and there's very small number. I mean, upwards of maybe no more than a few thousand Shia Muslims inside the country. And so they started with very little to work with. And in between, let's say 2005, 2006 to about now, 15, 16 years later, they not only have an embassy, they have a very strong relation to the government. They have all kinds of agreements on everything from economics to military agreements to cultural exchange. They have a military presence inside Bolivia. And they also have a very sophisticated intelligence presence that allows them to be at the heart of South America so that they can move to other countries. And so I argue that's even been more successful because they went from 0 to 50 in a very short amount of time. It's a difference to Venezuela, where they had an embassy for a lot longer that goes all the way back to pre-Islamic Republic, to the days of the OPEC and the founding of OPEC. But nonetheless, I think both of those cases have shown that Iran is capable of evolving its presence into Latin America to something that's much more significant than just staying at the informal grassroots level.
And I guess having particular leaning governments or regimes only facilitates its goals. More stable governments with a different political orientation would probably be less inclined to welcome Iran in their midst. So essentially, there seems to be a tie between a connection between Iran's successes and the political atmosphere in those countries.
And so that's a good point, because you would think that may be just coincidence, right? So Iran got lucky, and if there was a period of time, what they call the pink tide, where a bunch of leftist governments took over Latin America, and that gave them an opportunity. But what happened is that leftist tide, which was called the pink tide, which includes Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Argentina at the time, Brazil at the time, which is the first decade between 2000 and 2010, give or take, in Latin America. But then it was followed by what they call the conservative wave between 2010 and 2020, which is a shift to the right in Latin America. But Iran didn't recede. They didn't, because the right came into power, it didn't mean that Iran went away. They didn't shut one embassy. They didn't diminish their presence. They essentially kept and maintained. And I think you can argue that they weren't able to advance as fast as they perhaps wanted to, but they were able to stay because they understood what conditions are needed to be able to have some level of legitimacy in Latin America. And they maintained that. And now the region is actually shifting back to the left. And it's a very precarious position because, I mean, the world, I think in general, is having a democratic backslide. So these new leftist leaders in Latin America, they're not quite as democratic leaning as well, not to say the ones in the pink tide were, but nonetheless, care less about essentially advancing democracy in their countries and care much more about aligning geopolitically with Russia, China, and Iran. And I think Iran has that opportunity. So Iran invests into these movements, into these networks, so that these opportunities can be created so they can advance their interests. And so you'd be surprised if you're to unravel some of these endogenous Latin America movements, and you'd be surprised as to once you unravel it, you find a connection to Iran. I'll give you two quick examples real quick. Just like in Peru, a country where they don't have an embassy, they don't have a formal presence. They have one in all the countries surrounding it, Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, and Ecuador. They have a formal presence, but in Peru, they don't. But in Peru, they have an Islamic cultural center in a mountainous region called the Purimac. And what's interesting is in Peru, you would think that they wouldn't be able to exert their influence as much because without diplomats, without any formal presence, they have to rely on proxies. One of their biggest militant movements in Peru is a group called the Etnocaceristas. It's in that mountainous region where Iran has their Islamic culture center. They're essentially a separatist movement, but they're also an indigenous movement. And when you unravel the Etnocaceristas, especially the later years of the Etnocaceristas, you come to find out that they've been trained, financed, and cooperated with Iran. So Iran is working with the Etnocaceristas in Peru in the way that it works with the Houthis in Yemen. And so that for most Peruvians is like, it boggles their mind, because they don't, when they see the Etnocaceristas, an indigenous movement in their country, they don't think that there's a Middle Eastern actor somewhere behind it. So that really, I think, just shows that how Iran really knows how to work with proxies.
Indeed, I mean, Iran has shifted from relying only on Shia proxies like Hezbollah and kind of sort of Shia Houthis to whoever is willing to work with them, like Polisario in North Africa, and now the Etnocaceristas. And the question is, everything comes with a cost. Yes, Iran is willing to train, arm, provide weapons, provide basic, support, political support, but what at the same time, it acquires control over these movements. It gives them direction, and it ensures that they lose legitimacy with the opponents of Iran. When you have a foreign actor interfering with internal matters, it also kind of makes it less likely that to gain wider, broader support. Not to mention, there is a high chances of a government crackdown. How do these movements make their calculus and decide to adopt Iran despite these obvious inhibitions?
So, like, you mean like how do the Latin American government react?
Yes, but also how do these movements, why do they decide to go with
Oh, I
Iran
see.
when it's more likely to attract scrutiny from the
So,
government and cause them any popular support or sympathy?
that's a great question, because I think a lot has to do with Iran's sales pitch. And I mentioned this before. Iran, one thing that's different about how Iran operates in the Middle East to how it operates in Latin America is the way it presents itself. Obviously, in the Middle East, there's a much more religious component into talking about the Islamic revolution. And so they can talk about the 12th Imam and the resurrection, and all this other elements that would be more relevant to Muslim populations, specifically Shia Muslim populations in the region. Because that's not as relevant in Latin America, because the Muslim population is very small and also the Shia populations are even smaller, they don't present themselves necessarily that way at the beginning. Eventually they start to talk about that, but initially they don't begin the conversation that way. And one of the ways that they begin the conversation is they describe the Iranian Revolution as a more of a social movement. And so they don't focus on the religious aspects of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. They describe it as a social movement that lifted up to protect its natural resources, obviously talking about British petroleum at the time. And when you describe a revolution that way in Latin America, you say, we're actually here to protect natural resources. We're here to work against imperialist movements and powers, United States, and things like that. it actually opens a lot of doors because Latin America has a long history of social movements and indigenous groups fighting with Western powers over natural resources, mining, oil, and all that. So that commonality, that anti-imperialist nexus, allows them, or more specifically, the anti-imperialist narrative allows them to open doors in Latin America where they don't necessarily would have had otherwise. So I think Iran's been very smart. I think that's why they, in the first years, 10 years or so in Latin America, they spent a lot of it studying. They studied the region. They learned the actors. They learned the demographic trends, the political trends, the economic, socioeconomic factors, because they really figured out the right sales pitch for how to get Latin Americans to pay attention to them. And this doesn't mean that it works on everybody in Latin America, but there are segments of the population that it does work on. And largely, they're mostly leftist, but they're mostly what they would call anti-imperialist movements that also blend with what Maduro was doing or Chavez was doing back in the day, Maduro, the Castros in Cuba. It really brings that marriage between almost socialism and Iran's interpretation of Islamism.
It's interesting. It's even more interesting that after a while, all these people don't catch on that they've been had and that they're being manipulated. I think that eventually they would start asking questions. Why are these people here? What's their real agenda? And how come, XYZ happens to whoever they get involved in? Who is actually better off from the involvement? And, what country has become a paradise as a result of Iran's involvement? Yemen is a disaster zone. Lebanon is a disaster. Iraq is, Iraq and Lebanon, even the Shia have risen up against Iranian. So it clearly points to a complete lack of critical thinking or questions being raised at the very least, or if they are, that then clearly some other interests ignore them.
Yeah, I think also on kind of on the flip side, well, we're talking about movements in Latin America, indigenous movements, social movements. It could even be illicit actors that we might take to Iran because of they like that resistance narrative, the anti-imperialist narrative. But I think on the flip side, the governments in Latin America, I think this is where we've had a lot of challenge. There's a lot of ignorance as to Iran. Most governments in Latin America, they didn't pay a lot of attention to the Middle East. They don't have a full kind of geopolitical understanding of how Iran operates. And so many governments in Latin America think Iran is just like another democratic country in the world that looks to have diplomatic representation and maybe some commercial exchange. This actually, I thought, was highlighted to some level in Colombia. I don't know if you followed this news, but recently, I believe it was in November of last year, the Colombian government took a trip to Israel to sign a bunch of agreements and to work on some mutual defense issues. And the defense minister of Colombia, as he was leaving Israel, he mentioned in a press conference in Spanish to Colombian press that that Israel and Colombia have common enemies, and in that he mentioned Iran and Hezbollah. Now, to any of us or anybody in Israel, that's not a very snark statement. That's not even anything that would surprise you. You say, of course, yeah, Iran and Hezbollah is the enemies to pretty much most democratic free countries in the world. But to the Colombian population, or more specifically to the Colombian political class, they treated that statement as if he had just called Switzerland an enemy. And you should have seen the media reaction to this. They started to talk about how he's creating an enemy where there doesn't exist. The president of the country had to backtrack and say, we don't call any other countries enemies. And they took back the statement. It created, and I'm sitting there watching all this and I'm like, I mean, I understand you don't want to provoke a conflict with Iran. I get that. But you're talking about Iran now as if it's like Sweden from Europe. And it's just not the case. I mean, yes, there is a diplomatic representation of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Bogota, but that diplomatic representation isn't as significant as many of the other countries that Colombia does a lot more business with, even in the Middle East, even including Israel. And so I thought that kind of just shows how a lot of the political and the business elites in the media in Latin America really have a dearth of understanding of who Iran really is, the nature of the regime, the characteristics of the revolution, and why this is a real threat, not just for Iranians in the homeland or in the Middle East, but it's a global threat. It truly is a global threat, and Iran is a global actor. And I think in that, I think there are a lot of Latin American governments have a long way to go before they have that larger global geopolitical understanding.
I, it's funny that you mentioned that because the Israeli media only reported on this initial statement and did not cover any of the follow-up, which in my opinion is a major mistake on their part. They should be aware of the political difficulties their allies are facing, and they should be working with them to ameliorate these political hindrances, because if they take for granted um, they will quickly lose, take for granted their allies, they will quickly find in the next election cycle that they lose support. Unfortunately, we have seen some of this already in the Middle East, where Israel has sort of taken for granted the support they're getting on the highest level from some leaders, but they have underestimated the level of internal pushback that some of these leaders are facing. I'm concerned that the same may prove true for Latin America, and kind of hinder the positive dynamic in building relationships and alliances. Now, kind of getting back to the Iran's military positioning, we have seen some of the concerning moves in recent months. Um, we have seen some of the Iran sent a Houthi point person to Venezuela earlier in the year. This was followed by the recent Maduro's junket to Iran. What do you make of these developments? Why? What is happening there that is not getting as much as attention as it should, perhaps for a reason?
Yeah. So yeah. So Maduro, I think, is planning to go to Iran very soon. I don't think he's taken the trip quite yet, but he's definitely going to take it, and it won't be that much longer before he does. But so this visit that happened recently, both to Venezuela, then later to Nicaragua for the inauguration of Daniel Ortega, another dictator in Latin America and Central America, was the Iranian VP of Economic Affairs, Moshe Rezai. And so that was very controversial because this individual, this Iranian government official, Rezai, he has an Interpol red notice. He has an arrest warrant from Argentina because he was one of the planners of the 1994 Army attack. He was investigated by the Argentine prosecutors, and there was enough evidence that when that evidence was presented to a court in France, the Interpol courts in France, that they issued a red notice to capture him if he was to travel, and then Argentina also issued an international arrest warrant to capture. So he has an outstanding order of capture, and he was able to touch ground not just in Nicaragua, where he went for the inauguration of a dictator in Central America named Daniel Ortega, but he touched down in Venezuela. He touched down in Africa and Mauritania. So he took many stops on his way there, and the Argentines, not the government of Argentina, because they're kind of a little bit maybe weak on Iran, to say it nicely, but others in the country, other Argentinians, people that know about the terrorist attack that happened in their country in the 90s, they were up in arms because they're like, was anyone gonna even try to arrest this guy? I mean, he's moving around, he's jet skiing, he's skipping around in these different countries. He was in Nicaragua for 4 days. It's not like he just came and left. He was there for 4 days, and plenty of time to arrest him, plenty of time, and at the minimum, detain him, because he needs to be presented before the Argentine justice. But obviously, he's a government official from Iran, and Iran's not stupid. They calculated all the risks of sending him to the other side of the world in a very visible trip, and all the countries that he stopped to, whether it's Mauritania, Venezuela, ultimately to his destination in Nicaragua. Those are all countries where they knew that those governments in those countries were not going to do anything because they're allies or partners of Iran. They probably also calculated that the Argentine government, which should be the government that actually puts the legal mechanisms in motion to be able to at least have a legal argument for capture, or the legal process ready to capture and arrest him. They didn't even do that, and they probably calculated, they understood the Argentine government probably wasn't going to do that because they don't want to upset Iran or some of its international allies. So they essentially flew in the face of justice. They essentially made a mockery of the rule of law. They made the mockery of the victims of the Amia case, and they just showed more impunity. That I think that's the kind of bad message that essentially invites more of this bad behavior, this bad activity. So I think Iran now has almost a sense of confidence that they can operate in Latin America very freely, and even the people that have court proceedings that say that they should be questioned, or at the minimum questioned, but they should be detained and arrested for their alleged participation in the Ami attack, even they don't have a problem moving around in Latin America. So if they don't, then they might be able to have a bigger, more visible footprint without much problems.
So that leads me to believe, why did Iran choose to send that particular individuals? Yes, they were pushing the envelope, watching the international reaction. Yes, they wanted to send a high-ranking official to discuss important relationship matters. But what was the message? What about this particular individual's background, and what does it tell us about the underlying purpose of the visit, aside from just egging on the international community and getting additional publicity for Iran's freedom of navigation, so to speak, in those troubled waters?
Yeah, no, the message is very clear. The message is that they think they're above the law. And I guess they might be right, because it doesn't seem like they can get the repercussions for the actions that they've taken. They did this before, actually. They did this in 2011. In 2011, another Iranian official that was also involved in the Ami attack, he at the time was a defense minister of Iran in 2011. His name is Ahmad Vahidi. He's now the interior minister of the Raisi cabinet. So he's, again, a high-ranking government official. But he was one of the original commanders of the Quds Force. And actually, he was the head of the Quds Force when the Ami attack happened, and that's why he's implicated in that attack. Vahidi went to Bolivia in May 2011, and the same thing happened. The Argentine government, which back then was the Kirchner government, which is, as we know now, very friendly with Iran as well, and they did kind of like went through the motions. But at least in that case, they at least went through the motions of trying to apprehend Vahidi, and one of the prosecutor for the Ami case, the special prosecutor Alberto Nisman, who is now dead, and we can talk about that as well. He actually went to file the legal mechanisms to have an Interpol act inside Bolivia, which is why Vahidi had I think he stayed in Bolivia less than 24 hours. He arrived, he was at an inauguration, he had some meetings, and then he left to Iran. So Iran did this before, and I think the message back then was, we can come even to your doorstep, which Bolivia is next to Argentina, and you can't capture us. This time was even more flagrant, because not only did he fly to Latin, he stayed for a week. He might as well have been sitting on the beach, and no one really could touch him for whatever reason, because he had complete political cover from these governments that decided to protect this fugitive. And so in that sense, I think that that's really the message. They want to show this message that they're untouchable, they're above the law, at least in Latin America, at least in these specific countries. And I think in some sense, I guess it worked out for them.
While traveling to these countries, there's no doubt that Iran is pursuing additional deals with these countries, potentially. Initially it started out with oil refinement, which Iran had trouble getting elsewhere back in the day, when it had no zero oil refinement process. Not that it has greatly progressed since then, but there is questions of trade issues, but there is also potential, for less for more blatantly illegal operations that are managed through its proxies, crime, narco-terrorism, that sort of cooperation. Do you think somebody like this individual would be charged with managing those sorts of affairs? Well, why would somebody who is tasked with managing the relationship with the Houthis in Yemen be sent to travel to Venezuela and Nicaragua, if not for his experience with these types of networks?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to look at this. The first is to understand that Iran, I think, has a very clear understanding that the United States is their probably number one adversary in the world. I know even Israel is their top adversary in the Middle East, but globally, the United States is their number one challenge, their number one adversary, even their enemy, as they chant death to Satan and all that stuff in Iran. So in that, they understand that they have a geographic disadvantage with the United States because, we can deploy to the Middle East while we were in Afghanistan, we're in Iraq, Syria for a time being. So we have the ability to have pressure on Iran in their near abroad in ways that's uncomfortable for the Islamic Republic. And so they figured that they have to diminish that geographic disadvantage. They have to be able to pressure the United States in a way that they think is meaningful. But they can't do what we do. They're not a conventional strength. They don't have economic strength, nor do they have military strength. So they can't just deploy aircraft carriers to the Caribbean. They have to build an asymmetric presence. And I think that goes to the second point, which is Iran is a master of asymmetric warfare. They're not a master of conventional warfare. They actually are pretty bad at conventional warfare. They saw that in the Iran-Iraq war. But they're very good at asymmetric warfare. And the big difference between conventional and asymmetric is what they call the center of gravity. The center of gravity in conventional warfare is your military in different ways and means. But in asymmetric warfare, the military is no longer the main element. It's no longer the center of gravity. In asymmetric warfare, the main element is public opinion. So information warfare is asymmetric warfare. And in that sense, Iran's master at manipulating public opinion, manipulating perceptions, lying, deceiving, and all that kind of thing. So that allowed them to be able to be very dominant in the Middle East. That same know-how is very useful in Latin America to have these other dictators learn from that and then be able to apply those same methods to be able to advance their objectives in Latin America. And so it's kind of like a win-win on that sense. So it wins for Iran because Iran's able to place pressure on the United States in our near abroad in Latin America. It's a win for the Latin American authoritarian movements because it allows them to gain better know-how to advance their objectives, to be able to have more power and control in their country and in their neighborhood. And then it's a win also for Iranian proxies because they give some more funding, more support, and more reasons to exist. And so it really has become like what I guess Iran will call this axis of resistance. It's taking that axis of resistance global and truly making it that global power, which we got to understand that was the mandate of the Quds Force since day one, right? Was to export the Iranian Revolution. And when they wanted to export the Iranian Revolution, that didn't just stop at Syria. That meant that was going to go into Africa. And there's a lot of presence of Iran in Africa, particularly Northern Africa. And that was going to extend all the way to Latin America. And I think at this point, and I think that's the purpose of my work, is I try to explain to policymakers that they're getting very powerful. They're not this isn't the first inning in Latin America. They're not at a nascent stage of their development in the region. They've been there for 4 decades. At this point, I think it's safe to say that Iran can even have leverage to control certain governments in Latin America. I actually think in the case of Venezuela, I think the Iranian government has more leverage and more influence over the Maduro regime than Russia or China. And there's reasons that I could explain why I think that.
I would actually be very curious to hear that. I think that's a very important policy point you're making.
Okay, so let me see if I can get this in a kind of a short version, because basically, if you look at this like networks, right? And I think that that's a big part of how Iran operates. If you look at this like networks, there's 2 big networks in Venezuela and in Latin America that are the underpinnings that prop up these specific regimes. The first is a communist network, a socialist communist network, which is mostly managed by the Cubans in Latin America, but has strong connections to the ex-Soviets, now Russians, or the Communist Party in China. So the communist networks, which are in academia, they're in NGOs, they're in governments, but it's kind of well known, right? We've studied that, we know it, especially since the Cold War on. We kind of understood that. There's another clandestine network in Latin America that very few people have studied and people don't really know exists at a meaningful level, which is an Arab clandestine network, mostly Syrian and Lebanese. Because if you look at Latin America's history for the last 150 years, there have been waves of mass migration from Syria and Lebanon to Latin America at very sizable numbers. One of the biggest migrations in the world was from the Middle East to Latin America in the late 19th century and early 20th century. That was when the Ottoman Empire began to collapse, and then they were placing pressure against many of the Christians in the Middle East who then left, especially Maronites, that left the Middle East and went over to South America specifically. Then the Armenian genocide, then the Lebanese conflict, the Arab dictatorships, the Ba'athist Party and everything like that. I mean, so there's a wave of migration that's already happened. And because of that migration exists in Latin America, the Iranians began to understand those networks. And so if you look inside Venezuela, between the communist network and the Arab network's more powerful. It's what controls industry, petroleum. It's what controls the economy, and it's what controls the illicit activities that have more to do with money laundering and illicit finance. And so the communist networks are important, but they're not more powerful. And that's why you see people like Tarek El Assami, who's the Minister of Petroleum, pretty much has been control of the entire government from Minister of Interior to Vice President for the Economy to Vice President to Minister of the Industry to now Minister of Petroleum. He pretty much controls the country because he controls the Arab clandestine network. So Russia and China, while they have a lot of influence on the communist network, they don't necessarily have that network. That's much more, and not that obviously Iran's not Arab, but Iran works through the Arab proxies, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq.
That's actually an important point, because I think that is a point that is missing from the understanding of the US government officials in particular. They tend to view movements and proxies in explicitly political term and tend to underestimate kinship ties and the community ties and familial networks and how they can be utilized. And that's something that Houthis have become particularly proficient in. They've managed to create entire intelligent networks in Yemen based on kinship ties, on intermarital relations. And now it's clear that Iran seems to be looking to replicate the same model in Latin American countries using these proxy groups and communities and particular groups of people with particular proclivities and backgrounds.
No, for sure.
And no doubt that all of these people are not just random Syrians or Lebanese. They come as blocks of families and extended families, not just as just random people from all over. So they are more likely to share the same views, same ideological proclivities, and follow the same line in the event of making particular business or political social choices.
Yeah, I mean, so whether it's the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, they're mafias, right? So mafias understand how to coerce and infiltrate the diaspora. I mean, the Irish did it back in their day. The Italians did it back. The Russians do it. So it's not like a foreign thing, or it's not exclusive to just the Hezbollah or Assad, but it's the unfortunate consequence of refugee networks. We're very sympathetic to refugee networks because they are some of the most vulnerable people in the world. But because they're vulnerable to that exploitation by these mafias. And so Hezbollah absolutely looks at infiltrating pretty much every Lebanese community in the world because they need to have that presence to be able to dominate their power in Lebanon. When more than 15% of your GDP in Lebanon comes from remittances, that means you need to have a presence abroad to be able to control that financial flow and have power inside the country. And some of the biggest remittances to Lebanon come from Latin America, come from South America. That's why Hezbollah has been there for so long. And so I would say that to that point, that was one of the more understudied aspects of Venezuela and the Maduro regime. And I'll give you a little bit of a preview of what's to come next, because I think this is what most people are missing when it comes to Venezuela. So people now looking at Venezuela, looking at the economy, and it's, it hit rock bottom. It's now starting to, slowly dribble up, but it's, it's not going to be a thriving, prosperous country. But what we're seeing is Venezuela level off to where they're starting to grow a little bit, but we're not talking about the same kind of growth or the same kind of economy that was Venezuela in the 1990s. So people are making that mistake because they're confusing it. They're thinking about Venezuela as this successful, prosperous country that it could become, or this oil-based country that's going to export oil again to half the world. Neither of those things are going to happen because the economic implosion in Venezuela was so severe. I mean, 60% of its economy evaporated, that they're at an economic level to what they were equivalent in the 1950s. In the 1950s, Venezuela was not an oil-based economy. It was not an export. It wasn't an oil export leader in the world. It was an agricultural economy. And if you look at Venezuela today, they're much more of an agricultural economy than they are an oil-based economy. And who else are the agricultural economies? The Middle East. So the purpose of Maduro's trip to Iran, and then my understanding is he's also going to go to Syria. The purpose of that trip is to sign commercial agreements with Iraq, with Syria, with Lebanon, and then a big framework agreement with Iran to create what they call this resistance economy. And it's going to start with agriculture. But as we mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, all that commercial stuff is just a cover to be able to bring more military into the Western Hemisphere, to be able to finance more terrorists from both sides of the world, and to be able to create networks that are going to cause the same kind of troubles in the Middle East, but cause them in Latin America. There's a military saying that goes with amateurs talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics. These are logistical networks, and they connect two parts of the world in ways that we don't fully understand. And I think that that's something that the United States has to get really smart about, because if we don't get this, Iran's going to be, and not just Iran, Latin America is going to start looking more like the Middle East in a very short amount of time.
To some extent, we are already facing some of what you just mentioned. There are Hezbollah operations on U.S. soil in New York State, in other states that deal with all sorts of petty crimes and crime networks, cigarette networks, and things that basically support their schemes and operations and give them presence and establish presence. There's the open border policy with the Mexican cartels basically freely entering the country in various parts. There are gangs coming in from Central and South America. All of that, and we've had the infiltration of people on terrorist watch lists from Yemen making their way as far as these borders into Mexico and to the US. And the question is, how did they end up? So we are having a clear logistical issue where all these groups have an opportunity to enter the US, to procure things out of the US and move them outwards into Latin America, to move contraband into the US, to move weapon parts where they need them, if necessarily. That's not widely discussed. We focused on migrants and COVID, not on logistics, but there's nothing stopping, weapons parts, biological agents, or whatever else to be moved back and forth as necessary. And we are looking here at the situation where the U.S. security is in question. Back in the day, the Monroe Doctrine basically sent a message to the Europeans that the U.S. would not allow puppet monarchs and regimes to proliferate throughout neighboring countries and throughout the Western Hemisphere. But now we are seeing Iran introduce exactly that under another name. Okay, we're not dealing with Germany, France, Spain, or Portugal, or the United Kingdom. We're dealing with Iran, China, and Russia, threatening to move forces to buy up governments, and in cases of Iran, as providing terrorist and military support to regimes that are intimately connected to it. And we're creating danger zones in close proximity to the United States. Cuba is in almost immediate proximity to Miami. It's not that far at all. And Venezuela, come to think of it, has a potential to destabilize neighboring countries like Colombia and has already created a flow of refugees who can be similarly exploited wherever they are. So, in light of this Monroe Doctrine that held steady since its inception, but has now come uh, under question, what is the current administration thinking is going to happen if this pattern of activity continues? While the fruitless negotiations in Vienna are, you know, basically a distraction from anything else that's going on.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure what the administration has in mind on Latin America, but they haven't been very clear on their Latin America policies. I mean, they really haven't spoken about Venezuela much at all. They obviously haven't attended to the border issue very well, and they have a lot of problems in Central America. Uh, but I'd say this: I think if anything, I think the Biden administration needs to understand that Iran's influence abroad provides them leverage at home, and it also provides them leverage in these negotiations. It's what we saw with Russia recently. We saw Russia essentially do kind of a very subtle threat to the United States over the Ukraine issue about their amassing their troops on the border with Ukraine. And if the United States tries to sanction or do any kind of pressure mechanism against Putin, against Russia, well, they're talking about their presence in Cuba and Venezuela. They're saying, well, we don't discard having a military presence in Cuba and Venezuela. Here's the thing: they already do. Russia already has a military presence in Cuba and Venezuela. The fact that the United States knows that is how they're able to make credible on that kind of subtle threat. And that's the same thing that Iran will do with any kind of negotiations. Iran knows that the United States knows that they're very active in Latin America. The question is, what can we do about it? Because the governments in Latin America, the more they go in this authoritarian direction, the more sympathetic they become to Iran. I mean, there was a point in time between probably about 2016 to 2019. We had about 4 years where most governments in Latin America were U.S. friendly, market friendly, right of center, conservative even. And we had a lot of opportunity to put a lot of pressure on Iran in the region. Some of that we did. I mean, we were able to get some countries to designate. Well, I don't say we were able to get. We're at least to have a conversation on counterterrorism. To some countries ended up designating Hezbollah as a foreign terrorist organization, which was a good thing. It was a good first step. But we really needed to push that a little bit further. Now the challenge is that many of these countries are going in the opposite direction. Peru, for instance, is a country that's gone 180 degrees, and they're haven't openly done anything rhetorically or said anything rhetorically negative about the United States. But if you look at the undercurrent of the cabinet and the people that are there, it's just a matter of time because they're not friends of the United States. And then if anything, they're very sympathetic to countries like Iran. I actually think that if Iran is to open another embassy in Latin America, it may do it in Peru, depending on how far the Castillo government can advance. One of the first things the Castillo government in Peru did was they reversed 25 years of foreign policy of Peru and recognized the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, whatever it's called, in Western Sahara, a country that is not recognized by the international community. And they recognized it because the Polisario is an ally of Iran, And so that, you're seeing where Peru's going. And that's one sign that you're going to have Honduras and Chile who are going to be inaugurated their new presidents pretty soon. And I could fully expect both of those countries to align themselves with Iran as well, especially Chile, who Iran already has an embassy in that country and has a pretty active ambassador at that. So Iran is looking at all these like new opportunities, and they're very eager to continue to advance this, because whatever happens in Vienna, I could guarantee you one thing: no matter what they do, they're going to continue to move in Latin America because it gives them better leverage for these kind of scenarios.
It's kind of bizarre to me that U.S. is allowing all these foreign-led hostile operations right next door in countries that should have been natural allies to the United States, and if not natural, then at the very least, where U.S. could be doing a lot more to win hearts and minds and government support and so forth. And there is no similar kind of U.S. pushback against Iranian activities in the Middle East. On the contrary, we are seeing U.S. allies under attack every day. UAE was denied the opportunity to buy F-35. Now UAE was directly attacked by an Iranian-backed force. Whether that was Houthis or Iran itself, we don't know for sure. Houthis claimed credit, but that doesn't always mean that they were the ones responsible. We've seen multiple attacks at Saudi Arabia, inside Yemen, disrupting international maritime trade in the region. Now we are seeing the same thing possibly happening in Latin America. One issue that is not being broadly advertised is the potential for disruption of international trade, international maritime security in the region. I literally have not heard one word about that. What's your prediction for that?
Yeah, that's a great one because so we had a scare a little bit last year when I think it was in June or July. I think it was in June when there was two Iranian warships that looked like they might be arriving in Venezuela. Now, Politico, I think, covered this the most. They did repeated articles kind of covering the voyage as these ships were sailing around the coast of Africa. But here's the thing. A lot of people in Washington didn't really understand that. And they were like, oh, why would they go to Venezuela, or how, what does that mean? Or can they even make it? And those were all kind of good questions, but maybe not the right questions. The real question there is, what is Iran messaging with this? That's really what this is, because whether they go or don't go, that's kind of secondary. We'll find that out eventually. If they arrive, they'll arrive, and we'll know. But the question is, what are they trying to message? And I think Iran's, really that goes back to that asymmetric warfare. That it's all about how they message and manipulate. And what they were messaging essentially, and I wrote an op-ed about this with a colleague, a good friend named Ilan Berman from the American Foreign Policy Council, and they're starting to message that Iran is a global power. That was the message. It didn't matter whether those ships got there or not for Iran. They probably couldn't make it there in that voyage. They actually went up to Russia. They never went to Venezuela. But I think they wanted to purposely make the United States think they were going to Venezuela because they wanted to project this image that Iran can have a blue water navy, that Iran can actually patrol the oceans. And that goes into what you're saying about maritime security, because they understand that there's a weakness in the international community in the waters. We don't have an international maritime security framework to deal with Iranian aggressions or asymmetric amphibious operations the way they do in the Gulf of Oman and in the Persian Gulf in other parts of the world. The Caribbean's not ready for that. And what I think Iran is going to do, I don't think they necessarily need to bring warships to the Caribbean. They may do that at some point, but they don't necessarily need to do that. What they're doing is they're building the asymmetric naval capabilities of its partners in Latin America, most notably Venezuela in this case. And if you look at the Caribbean, and if you study the Caribbean, it's full of maritime border disputes. I mean, there's countries that have historic disputes over where the water begins and ends in terms of sovereign territory. So that's ripe for what they call gray zone conflicts, all these conflicts where you can position small vessels and things to be able to agitate and create tension on the border. The same way you see tension on land borders, you see that mostly with migrants and illicit actors. In the case of the water, you see it with vessels and in some cases fishery. And so I think Iran's preparing very much to be able to provide that capability to its partners in Latin America. And in this case, I think the three ones that you really want to look at is Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And so it doesn't mean that these navies of these three countries need to be powerful, because the Iranian Navy really isn't that powerful, but they just need to have the know-how to be able to cause these problems, exploit these border disputes, and to create the conflict necessary to provide more opportunities to advance on bigger objectives. It's the same playbook that they've done at the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, and they're bringing that to Latin America. I don't think necessarily they're going to do it initially themselves. I think they're going to teach their partners, that's the way Iran operates, right? They teach their proxy, and their proxy doesn't, and they have plausible deniability. But that's why a deputy commander of the Quds Force is going to be in Venezuela, because he's going to be training and teaching the Venezuelan forces how to do these kind of asymmetric operations.
So actually, that brings to mind another issue that U.S. had this program called the Sentinel that was supposed to, or at least it had this initiative for a while, that was supposed to respond to Iran's abduction of vessels in the Strait of Hormuz and whereabouts. From what I am seeing, it had not had a very long life.
Mm.
Another initiative in the Red Sea was the Red Sea Littorals Alliance, led by Saudi Arabia, involving Egypt, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and a couple more countries. And from what I understand, that too is not really functional due to A, conflicts between some of these members, and B, internal conflicts between among other members. So I'm not really sure how that works, but the strategic choke points and littorals in that general vicinity, Horn of Africa, Red Sea, extremely important and should probably be guarded by some alliance, which really, and there's been some works on that, but not nearly as much as there should. Is there any sort of program under consideration related to these maritime dispute areas in Latin America, Caribbean? Are
So,
there? Mhm.
so obviously in Latin America, in this, I'd say, I can't say that Iran is absolutely working in this direction with 100% certainty and proof, but I can say that based on our research, and it's ongoing, so we're not in any definitive conclusion, it appears that's the direction they're going. Now, in order to put a definitive statement on that, I'd have to spend a little more time on the research, but it definitely looks that way, which that's why I'm comfortable talking about it. But I think if we were to look at any of the countries in the Caribbean that I think the border dispute is very tense, and there's a bunch of them, but I'd say one of the ones that's probably the most tense is between Venezuela and Guyana. They have a historic border dispute. But it's also on the land. It's also in the physical border, but it's in the water as well. And then there's a lot of oil that's actually in the water. And I think ExxonMobil discovered that oil a few years ago. And so, nonetheless, you have this very intense maritime border dispute between Guyana and Venezuela. You have Guyana, a pro-U.S. President in Guyana, and not to mention a country that has a lot of defense cooperation with the United States, and Maduro regime in Venezuela with a lot of defense cooperation with Iran. It kind of sets a scenario to have a sort of proxy conflict with the United States and Iran on the border of Guyana and Venezuela. Now, I'm sure the Guyanese, that if they're listening to this or don't want to hear that, they're probably like, "Oh, we don't. That's the last thing we need is to have a proxy conflict between Iran and they don't want to have a Houthi conflict on and their waters." But I think we have to be prepared for these contingencies because it's not like they're that far away from reality. And again, I said this doesn't mean that this is 100% going to be this way, but these are contingencies, scenarios that are plausible and worth examining, at least thinking through, because they may become reality in a short amount of time. There's other border disputes in the water. Nicaragua, Colombia has a very historic border dispute. Colombia, Venezuela has a historic border dispute. Belize has a maritime border dispute. I believe it's with Guatemala. Nicaragua, Costa Rica has a land border dispute. I mean, if you go to Latin America, it's a region full of border problems. The last major wars, conventional wars in Latin America, the wars of the Pacific, were fought over border disputes. So it's a country that's ripe for these kind of exploitation of border conflicts. Which I'll just make a quick shameless plug, because we actually at SFS spent a lot of time at looking at these gray zone conflicts and these borders. And we are releasing a series of videos called Border Wars. And it's actually, I travel to a lot of these firsthand, to a lot of these borders myself, to get a sense of how dangerous they are and how what's the threat level. And so in the past, I would take a few pictures, I would write a report, and I'd publish it, or I'd send it to policy folks. Now, with the new age, we're able to film it. And so we have the first episode, it's about the Colombia-Venezuela border, which is probably the most dangerous border in the Western Hemisphere. As much as Americans are worried about our border, southern border with Mexico, if things continue to go in the direction they're going, they need to look at the Colombia-Venezuela border, because that's as bad as borders can get, where it's beyond just a humanitarian crisis or migration crisis with refugees. It's an armed conflict among irregular actors with daily bombings, IEDs, kidnappings, murder, all kinds of drugs, but a real conflict where every day there's mass atrocities, kind of like what you see in the borders in the Middle East. And so that video will be out soon. And not too far behind that is Russia, is Iran, these big geopolitical actors that are exploiting these circumstances.
I am very glad that you mentioned those because I would very much like to organize some panel discussions with the viewing of these videos once they are released. So please do keep me posted. I'd be happy to kind of get something done around those topics. I think they're very interesting. They deserve far wider attention. They deserve to be discussed, and they deserve to generate really, really hardcore policy analysis and not just, not just be skimmed or forgotten. And by the way, you're also welcome to publish with the Washington Outsider on any of these topics or whatever you think is maybe of interest, because we also seek to provide coverage to issues that are generally overlooked but are important in security, geopolitical, foreign policy arenas from angles that are sometimes out dismissed or otherwise or ignored. So thank you so much for these mentions. I think that was a very kind of disturbing projection, but I think it should be the goal of anyone really involved in analysis, not just to rehash what has already happened, but to draw conclusions and make predictions and prepare for eventualities and possibilities that unfortunately are very, especially ones that are very likely to happen based on the current trends, at least. And unfortunately, there's not nearly enough of that being done. I think a lot of what passes for analysis in general think tanks is basically the rehashing of the same old about the same types of issues that draw a lot of funding, attention, and are popular because they're easy. But these issues require the same level of dedication. And thank you so much for drawing attention to them and for educating. And I've personally learned a lot just from listening to you today. Appreciate you joining the program. You're welcome to join the Washington Outsider in the future. And I hope everyone who's had a chance to view this video will go to the Center for Secure Free Society and look at the other works, other reports on Latin America, on Iran, and learn something new. You never know what direction that prompts you to think and to explore. It's always great to look at different angles and issues from the usual. Thank you so much. That was Joseph Humire. This was the Washington Outsider Report. We'll be back next week, same time, 9 p.m. Tuesdays. And thank you for watching. Have a great night.